Hi, my name is Amanda Panacea, and you're listening to the Healer Revolution podcast. This is a community for self-healers, biohackers, practitioners, and any other helping professionals. You're in the right place if you're seeking conversations about how pain becomes passion, the connection between physical, energetic, mental, and our spiritual self, finding your body's ancient wisdom, the latest biohacking technologies, clinical research, and if you just want to nerd out about complex biochemistry and quantum physics. But this is also for entrepreneurs who seek infinite abundance and a supportive community. So pour a cup of King coffee or Sisters tea and let's join the revolution. Hello, and welcome back to the Healer Revolution podcast. I am Amanda Panacea, and I'm really excited for this episode because long overdue. This is going to be all about mast cell activation syndrome and histamine intolerance, which are some of my favorite topics. These were some of the hardest things that I struggled with, and primarily a large struggle for most of the people I work with. Most everyone knows what histamine is because there is the medications of antihistamine. And so we've all kind of experienced, well, I would say probably 90% of the population has experienced taking an antihistamine and probably getting really tired and really sleepy. But essentially, the symptoms of the high histamine improved unless you have the pleasure of experiencing the condition of mast cell activation. And then sometimes those antihistamines help, sometimes they don't help all the symptoms, sometimes they help too much, and we get really addicted to them, or we can get prescribed them and be on them for long periods of time, which was part of my story. And so I wanted to go deeper into all of the information that I have put on my mast cell activation and histamine intolerance guide. We won't get into all the details that is in that guide. I believe right now I just redid that guide again, and it's over 100 different pages. So it goes into a lot of detail that we just won't have time to cover today. But just getting into what on earth is histamine? So histamine is a biogenic amine. It's a naturally occurring chemical in the body that has multiple very important functions. So histamine is not bad. You'll never get rid of all your histamine, and you don't want to because it's very important. Most people know it again as like the allergic reactions. Histamine causes the itching, the swelling, the sneezing, along with other mast cell mediators and anything related to like hives, eczema, stuffy nose, asthma. Those things are pretty commonly well known because histamine is involved in the allergic response, but it's also involved in the immune response. It actually helps us to fight off infections. It's also important for neurotransmission. So it is a brain chemical that affects mood, focus, and energy. It's also involved in gastric acid secretion. So it actually aids digestion by stimulating stomach acid. So low histamine can affect our stomach acid, which of course can affect the infections and overgrowth in our gut, which can unfortunately cause more imbalances in histamine. Histamine is also involved in inflammation and blood vessel regulation. So it helps regulate circulation and immune activation. And we can either obtain histamine or histidine, which is an amino acid, through food, or we can also make histamine in the body. When our mast cells and our basophils degranulate, we can make histamine, or we can get exposed to it from outside the body. And then that histidine from food sources gets converted into histamine in certain cells, including the mast cells, the basophils, and gut cells. And then histamine is stored and released when it is we are triggered by allergens, stress, or an injury. Heavy focus on the word stress here. Histamine binds to receptors in different organs, and depending on the site that it's bound to is going to depend on the symptom. And then histamine is broken down by enzymes. The two enzymes that break down histamine, one is the DAO enzyme, or the diamine oxidase enzyme, and this breaks down histamine in the gut. you can get this enzyme through the form of kidney glandular, which is very high in DAO. And you can try before eating or even after eating on an empty stomach and notice if symptoms have lowered. And that can give you some insight as to, okay, it must be I'm not breaking down this in the gut. We'll get into like genetics and things like that. Like I have a genetic predisposition to having very poor DAO enzyme function. However, with these SNPs, there's a reason why they're presenting this way. So nutrient deficiencies, which we'll get into, is going to play a big role with if that enzyme is functioning as well. In some of the mineral balancing podcasts that I've done and I've had guests on, we talk about enzyme function being lowered if we've got, say, a heavy metal in the receptor site for a mineral. And for example, copper is really important for the DAO enzyme. So if we've got a metal in that receptor site instead of, say, copper, then that enzyme is not going to function as well. So you can, even if you have poor histamine breakdown genes like I do, we can still support that pathway and we can eventually become lower in symptoms or asymptomatic as well. Then next we have the enzyme HNMT, histamine N methyltransferase, and this one primarily clears histamine in the brain and in the nervous system. So this one you can also get genetics tested for how well this enzyme is working, or if you have any predisposition to SNPs that can affect this enzyme as well. If either of these enzymes aren't functioning properly, or we've got poor function, or we're making too much histamine in the body, which is very common, which we'll get into, and these enzymes can't keep up, then we might have an overflow of histamine in the body. Now, histamine is just one of the inflammatory mediators that mast cells are releasing into the body. They also are releasing lots of other inflammatory mediators, which we won't necessarily get into in this podcast, but there are other factors that can cause some of those symptoms in mast cell activation that are not just related to histamine. So what's the difference between histamine intolerance and mast cell activation? So histamine intolerance is the wording is not quite correct. It's not that you're intolerant to histamine. It's more so that the body is either not breaking down histamine as well or efficiently as you could, or the body is overproducing histamine in response to an infection or stressor or injury, and then those enzymes can't keep up. So the histamine bucket has overflowed to the point where we're having symptoms. Now, mast cell activation is an entire system, full experience of chronic inflammation, and it's very debilitating. So the biggest difference is with histamine intolerance, you can lower that histamine bucket and start to notice that your hives and rashes or flushing and itching or nasal congestion and sneezing or GI symptoms or even heart palpitations, low blood pressure start to improve when you do go on a low histamine diet or when you take the DAO enzyme. Whereas mast cell activation accompanies the entire mental, emotional, physical body, and it's all the systems are affected. So histamine intolerance is usually a more mild and can easily be controlled with some support, lifestyle, dietary changes, whereas mast cell activation is more debilitating, full body, heavy nervous system involvement, as well as all of the different systems are affected in some way. So some other symptoms of histamine intolerance, it can really affect almost any system in the body. The biggest ones obviously are going to be the itching, the rashes, but also stuffiness, redness, flushing. Nervous system involvement is common. So insomnia, histamine is very stimulatory. So anxiety and insomnia are also common. Also, the GI system, almost, I would say, 5 times out of 10 is heavily involved. So anything from diarrhea, maybe constipation, nausea, abdominal pain, and definitely more sensitivities to food. You eat something and you either have a reaction in another part of the body, or you eat something and you don't feel so good. Skin is a big one. So the hives, the flushing, the eczema, the dermatographia, which is where you can write on your skin and it stays raised and red. The cardiovascular system is probably the most scary part of the body that can be affected by histamine. Uh, that high histamine can cause lower blood pressure, heart palpitations. Anaphylaxis, of course, can affect the heart. So if you have like immediate, very intense IgE allergic responses, then potentially that can affect the cardiovascular system. And there's a study that was published that showed that when they gave people pure histamine and they measured the symptoms that they had, the more histamine that was in the body. And when they did some of the studies on rats, once the rats hit a certain threshold, which is like 10 times the amount you would ever have in your body just from, food and environmental triggers, they actually went into cardiac arrest. So the end result of extremely high histamine is cardiac arrest. Again, do not worry. That's not anywhere you could ever get to, despite living in mold, despite having really high stress and trauma, despite eating high histamine. Like, you'll never get to that point. Don't worry. Then we have the respiratory system. So wheezing, asthma, lung symptoms, overactive or closing airways is very common. And in that study, once they hit a certain threshold of histamine in the body, people were experiencing the asthma-like symptoms. Then we also have the endocrine system. So mast cells influence our hormones, potentially leading to thyroid dysfunction, hormonal imbalance with like the sex hormones. Histamine and estrogen are BFFs, and they both fuel each other to stay high. Histamine and cortisol and estrogen are the three amigas. They all fuel each other to stay high. And we'll talk about some mineral imbalances that can also affect that as well. But those are the big ones. And so, as you can see, almost any system in the body can really, oh, and then of course the brain, the nervous system, the brain, high brain fog, high anxiety, racing thoughts, insomnia, kind of like I mentioned as well. So any and all symptoms almost can be related to overactive mast cells or histamine intolerance. So kind of going back to which is what histamine intolerance versus mast cell activation. Just because you have histamine intolerance does not mean that you have mast cell activation. Um, there's really no good test for it, which goes into detail in the guide about why there's no good test, what are the drawbacks of some of the tests that you may have been told to do. Like, how can I get tested to see, do I have mast cell? There really is nothing that is going to be there. That there's no good Western test, that's for sure. Some of the functional tests even I don't like as well. Like, you can test plasma histamine, you can test DAO levels, but histamine levels fluctuate throughout the day, and also the handling for that sample is really important. It has to be stored a specific way. So false negatives are really common if the histamine's already been metabolized or if it wasn't stored correctly. For the DAO enzyme, levels in the blood don't always correlate with gut function. So that's, unless you're going in and testing the gut, which there's no test for that. A normal DAO enzyme in the blood is not going to translate to having good histamine breakdown in the gut. Tryptase levels is another big one that people are often recommended, but elevated tryptase is more indicative of systemic mastocytosis, which is not the same thing as mast cell activation. And so many people that are struggling with mast cell activation syndrome have normal tryptase levels, and I've met and worked with quite a few of them. You can also do urine tests for some markers. You can do the genetic testing, like I mentioned. My genetics kind of made sense for some things, but wasn't my life lived experience in a lot of other ways. So I know some people have had so much success with understanding their genetics. But for me, it just still felt like a small piece of the puzzle. And there were some things that stood out is like, oh, you probably have this symptom or don't have this symptom, or you probably really struggle with this or don't have any problems with this. And I was like, that's not my lived experience. So with genetics, I think everyone should have it done since you only have to do it once, which is awesome. But it's not always the whole picture. You know, it's not going to tell you exactly what to do just from your genetics. And I have worked with a lot of people who have come to me after trying all sorts of things recommended based off their genetics from very, very brilliant scientists and genetic scientists and people who really understand this information, and they still really struggled with mast cell activation because with mast cell activation, remember I mentioned there is significant nervous system involvement. And so other things can be influencing your body, your response, even more so spiritually, emotionally, nervous system based, trauma based than what might show up in genetics. Then for functional testing, you know, people will do the GI map, they'll do the organic acid test, maybe a Dutch hormonal panel, a hormonal panel, and they might get a little bit of insight. Each of these tests are over 300 up to like 600-ish dollars. So they can be pretty pricey and they're only giving you a teeny piece of the puzzle. If you have gut symptoms, chances are your GI map is going to be out of control, right? If you are like, it's like a no-brainer. But because mast cell activation and oftentimes histamine intolerance is more systemic, just looking at the gut or just looking at hormones is not going to give you the whole piece of, well, what do I do about this? The O test is pretty great because it is looking at more than just the gut. It's also looking at neurotransmitter function and can give good, deep insight into nutrient imbalances. But again, it can often be just one piece of that puzzle. I wouldn't build a protocol based on any of those results unless we were going really, 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 really slowly, which sometimes, and a lot of times with mast cell, we do have to do anyways. But the two types of testing that I really love is going to be the bioenergetic testing as well as the HTMA. Now, if somebody is super, super sensitive, I lean towards that bioenergetic testing because we can see the entire full picture of what's going on based on several different markers that may come up. We can see the toxin exposure, we can see neurotransmitters and methylation pathways that may need support. We can see the hormones that are imbalanced. We can see the nervous system involvement. We can see limiting beliefs, generational patterns that are passed down. It's just really incredible how much information we can get from using the type of bioenergetic testing that I use. And then second, HTMA. So both can give deep insight as to what nutrients are needed and how much, and what pathways do we need to support and in what way. I found that there are two, well, this is my opinion. I will say this has no research backed by anybody, but after working with so many people that have struggled with mast cell activation, I find that there are two different big categories, and sometimes people might go from one to the other and vice versa. So it's not, like I said, this is just kind of a pattern that I've noticed. But one type of mast cell activation is that highly, highly sensitive reactive type, which you have to be extremely careful over what you're introducing. Even positive changes like doing something that may feel good or may even be very relaxing, may even be triggering for someone with this type in the most extreme cases, because any type of change, positive or negative, any type of fluctuating temperature or mood changes can affect the mast cells. Your mast cells can be so hypersensitive that they will release the mast cell mediators at the smallest inkling of change. And part of this is going to have a lot to do with the limbic system involvement. The hypothalamus does have histamine receptor sites as well, and the hypothalamus helps to determine, are we going into fight or flight or not? And based on the study of psychoneuroimmunology, we know that your nervous system and your limbic system or your nervous system and your immune system have a very similar goal. Am I in danger? Is there a threat? So I like to tell people, if you are really, really struggling with mast cell activation, you are in this threat. And that in my 6-layer model is the most outer layer. Like we know that we're dealing with a threat. Like our body feels like it's under threat constantly, and it's going to be more reactive when it feels that way. This is where we need mast cell support, like stabilization of the mast cells, as well as nervous system involvement. Maybe not. Let's go deep into a relaxation state because that might be too intense. But we need to start dipping our toe into some nervous system regulation work, some somatic type work. There on the histamine and mast cell guide, I have a long list of a variety of tools for self-soothing, like when you're in an active flare, as well as quite a few different modalities that I think are helpful for whatever resonates with you. If you find a good practitioner in any of these type of modalities, that can help you with dipping your toe into that nervous system regulation, as well as that very foundational stuff, which we'll get into in a second. But type 1, highly reactive, very sensitive, probably is down to a very low amount of foods and activities they can tolerate, and just really not able to tolerate massive changes. So that's type 1. And then type 2 tends to be where I felt like I was, which was just this insane inflammation that it wasn't flaring, it wasn't reactive, it just was so intense and chronic and never got better, but never really got worse either. And you can tolerate a lot of different interventions, but they do absolutely nothing. Like with a very sensitive type person, you get instantaneous feedback, right? Like, oh, okay, well, that felt good and everything was fine. And you can listen to the voice in your head and you can feel the sensations in your body, and you start to develop that intuition for what you need and what feels good and what is a big no. And am I doing this out of desperation to heal, or do I feel called intuitively to this therapy or this person? Versus the chronic, unrelenting inflammation that nothing seems to make better or worse. You're just left in this constant state of um, like, I don't know what to do because I'm not getting the feedback, right? So you're just trying and trying and trying all sorts of stuff, and you don't know if anything's doing anything. You can spend massive amounts of money on really expensive protocols and gadgets, and just nothing puts a dent in it. But the good news is, even if you ate low histamine, or even if you ate pizza and ice cream, which I did at one point when I was in topical steroid withdrawal, because I just gave up for a brief period there, I didn't notice any difference. So there, I was like, well, why am I restricting myself so much if it's not going to make a difference? Luckily, I moved through that pretty quickly and went back to, okay, I know that even if I don't consciously feel or notice a difference, I do know that this isn't going to get me closer to my goals. So there's no good or bad type of mast cell activation. I've just noticed that there are those uh, two different types. And the second type I've seen do really well with mineral balancing because they can tolerate replenishing the nutrients. They can tolerate larger protocols with multiple different supplements in there. And they tend to finally see some sort of movement, up or down, good or bad, with the mineral balancing approach. You don't have to have mast cell activation to use that approach, of course. I've just, for myself included, noticed that when I switched from trying all sorts of stuff that didn't make sense, or even trying to just address pathogens that I really wasn't getting anywhere, but when I really started to address the nutrition, which makes sense when you understand histamine and the role methylation has with histamine, and the role certain organs and certain neurotransmitters interact with histamine, why mineral balancing would make such a big difference, because you're supporting so many different pathways that probably need supported. And with mineral balancing, you use the HTMA test. I like to do both of them, but with somebody super sensitive, sometimes we'll wait on mineral balancing because we won't be able to do those protocols, but we can still support with homeopathy and lifestyle changes based on what's coming up. And bioenergetics gives all the little gaps that mineral balancing may need, all the in between information. And kind of also, I see mineral balancing protocols or something very similar resonating for people on bioenergetics. So I know that they overlap a lot in their recommendations. So there's no like right or wrong, good or bad. So once you have met with somebody to work with them, moving on to that second layer. So the top layer of histamine intolerance and or of mast cell activation is that cell danger response. We are in a chronic threat. We need to break this cycle or we need to get out of the threat cycle. And supplements can be part of that, but the foundations also is going to include things like circadian rhythms and nervous system regulation, somatic awareness, somatic listening, possibly trauma work, maybe not at this phase or stage of starting to jump in. This may also include some stabilization with medications, which I find that if somebody's really, really struggling to make any sort of changes, and they are in the cycle of being so sensitive they can't tolerate anything, or so inflamed that nothing's making a difference, that medications can be temporary relief to stabilize mast cells. In the guide, I go over every type of medication that is out there and pros and cons, and talk that over with your doctor. I personally did compounded ketotifen as well as Xanax at night. The doctor I was seeing actually looked at me and said, "You need this Xanax in the morning," but I knew how addictive that was, so I did not do that. And then also I tried Dupixent, which is a biologic medication for a while. And there's all sorts of other options. LDN or low dose naltrexone is a great option for people as well. I didn't personally notice any difference, and it can take time to find the dose, but for some people it is very helpful and also pretty safe compared to side effects and long-term use. And then this can be helpful for a couple months because when the mast cells are triggered, they're going to recruit all of their mast cell friends and they're going to stay in that cascade of activation for a pretty long period of time. I've read a couple months is standard. For me, I mean, I would say at least 3 months of stabilizing the condition is probably going to be needed, depending on how sick and how inflamed that you are. And I was off of everything ish by about 6 months and then took things as needed after that. So 6 to 9 months I've seen is pretty common for using medications. Layer two is going to be the second layer is going to be chronic infections, immune and nervous system activation. So we know we're in this cell danger response, this chronic threat feeling state because of these things. We've got a long-term history of stress or trauma that has affected the way our immune system handles toxins, and now we have chronic infections. The problem with mast cell activation is that going after these infections oftentimes is going to make people worse. And so we can't always do that. And sometimes we have to skip this entirely, which is why I like mineral balancing, because there's no targeting pathogens with mineral balancing. The deeper the third layer is going to be organ and tissue stress stagnation. So we know, like, why would we have these chronic infections? Why would we have chronic nervous system activation? Well, our organs are stressed, our tissues are stressed, they're inflamed. A lot of overlap symptoms like connective tissue disorders, hypermobility, Ehlers-Danlos syndromes. We have mast cell receptors in our connective tissue, and so one problem might be re-triggering the other and vice versa. Same thing happens with POTS, which affects that fluid balance of the body, and we can have really low blood pressure and really poor circulation. They both trigger each other. So once we have one condition and one symptom, it's going to fuel the others because again, mast cells respond to fear, stress, a threat, something happening in the body that's too scary and the body doesn't know how to handle it, like really low blood pressure. We've got to get the adrenaline up. mast cells are going to degranulate in that situation. So that's why some of these conditions go together, because mast cells, they are responding to everything, and we also have receptor sites almost pretty much everywhere in the body. So this is where people sometimes will get stuck as well, because they're like, okay, well, I've been quote unquote doing drainage and detox. And sometimes for this type of people, it means coffee enemas and saunas and castor oil packs and rebounding, lymphatic drainage. But there's still a reason, like, why would our organs not be functioning? Why would everything be inflamed? Why would things not be moving? Let's go a little bit deeper. Well, the organs are made up of tissues, and the tissues are made up of cells, and the cells need nutrients to function properly. But we also need appropriate signaling from things like hormones and neurotransmitters. So, on the smallest level, we're looking at how each and every cell is able to either make energy or welcome in hormones or glucose or nutrients to the cell so it can use it, and also how well is that cell at getting rid of the waste. So again, we can use things like homeopathy, which works maybe on that energetic level, to help balance something like the sodium potassium pump, which is electrical, or the communication between neurotransmitters, or calcium ions, and the way that they affect the brain and the nervous system. We can use energetic medicine for that, energetic healing like homeopathy, or energy work like I do theta healing as well. Or we can use nutrients to replenish the nutrients needed for these processes. Um, and then, okay, great. That sounds like the smallest level. Can we get any smaller? Why would we have such bad nutrient imbalances? Why would we have such bad hormonal imbalances and neurotransmitter imbalances? Well, for one, we live in a world now where our soil is very depleted. We have extensive pollution across the globe, which is going to disrupt nutrients. It's going to cause stress on the body. And on top of that, we live in a modern society with chronic stress. Our light environment is terrible now. Nobody is outside enjoying nature. We're all on screens. We're all bathing in non-native EMFs. And then on top of just modern lifestyle, we also all struggle collectively with the stress of having to know everything constantly, news, the COVID era, waking up, politics, all of that stuff is collectively stressful for the time we live in now. And then we all also struggle with our own mental, emotional, generational trauma that now, because of social media, which is a positive, we have access to understanding, why am I like this? Why was my family like this? Um, the attachment styles, attachment wounds, and childhood, not just big T traumas, but quote unquote little T traumas, which affect how our nervous system was shaped. So if you have ever struggled with people pleasing or codependency or any sort of addiction, or you feel very anxious in your relationships, or you don't feel good enough, or you are always afraid people are going to abandon you, or you suspect that everyone is going to betray you, all of these types of attachment wounds and relationship traumas, even just on the smallest, like not a big T trauma, that shapes the way your nervous system responds to things. And if our nervous system learned to not speak up, if especially as women we fell into the traps of feminism, which is like you can be superwoman and do all of it, you can have a career, a family, an education. You can also cook all your meals from home and have a perfect body, which, come on, like we all know that that lie that was fed to us was wrong. If you have preconceived notions that life needs to be a certain way, or you need to be a certain way, and you don't fit into that cookie cutter box of your expectations for life, you are going to struggle. You're going to suffer. Suffering happens when we resist what is. So if you are living in an environment or in a job or in a relationship or in a body that you think is not the way it should be, and you're constantly wanting to change it, wanting to fix it, there's nothing wrong with wanting to better yourself or to work hard towards a goal. But if you are having a hard time with acceptance and surrendering to that current state, that current situation, there's going to be difficulty with the way that you move through life. So that resistance, as well as we want, with the work that I do with somatic awareness and somatic listening and somatic embodiment, we oftentimes are very much so stuck in our head, and the mind body connection is very disconnected. And even like in the world of self-help, what did that start with? Well, that started in Western culture with therapy, which is a very top-down approach. It's just in the mind and just thinking. And anyone who's tried to control their mind is sadly met with the fact that that will never happen. You are always going to have thoughts that are not your own. Your voice in your head is not you. You don't have to listen to it. Your feelings are valid, but they are not the truth. So we can have a visceral response to something, we can be triggered in a way, and we can learn to sit with that, to feel it without covering up, without avoiding, without shaming ourselves for even feeling a certain way to begin with. And we can learn to be with that discomfort for the trigger that we experienced, but we also don't have to listen to the voice in our head that says, oh, that happened because of this, and you will never get the thing that you want. And, you know, you're never going to heal. This is never going to work for you. This works for other people, but it's not going to work for you. You know, all those things, your mind is always going to try to make meaning of it. Your mind and your ego is always, always, always going to be trying to protect your identity, which makes change very difficult. Anything that is unfamiliar is going to feel scary, and your brain is going to try to get you to stay in what's predictable, even if it is shitty, even if you feel pretty horrible. Your brain is not wired for transformation, it is wired for survival. And makes sense looking back biologically. Everyone previous to us survived, so let's just do whatever they did, because if we step outside of that box, we don't know what's there, and it could be dangerous. So it makes sense for our species survival, but again, it's not going to keep you, or it's not going to allow you to get to your goals. So doing inner work is absolutely essential for recovering from mast cell, because you start to think and behave in a way that makes your world very, very small when you start to have such severe reactions and when you have trouble even functioning. So, coming out of that is going to feel very scary. And learning how to be with those uncomfortable situations and to be aware and non judgmental of that voice in your head is a huge part of recovery, bridging that mind body connection. Again, with mast cell activation, there's an extensive nervous system involvement. So we absolutely have to give grace to that. And I worked with so many people who, um, like they have a hard time doing anything else. So to me, that's like a red light at an arrow pointing towards, this is where you need to put your focus. Like if you cannot take supplements, if you have a hard time with going outside and being in heat or being in cold, or have a hard time with sunlight, even those foundational things, if you're having a hard time with food, your messenger, creator, God, the universe, whatever you believe in, is saying, hey, this is where the focus needs to be, the nervous system. And that is scary, because a lot of us have adapted these coping mechanisms for avoiding dealing with feelings. And people oftentimes will say, like, well, I'm afraid that my feelings, my emotions, and leaning into this will really dysregulate me even more. And it's funny, that's never happened ever, not even once. It can happen if you don't have the foundational tools for building capacity. Like if you jump right into, let's say, like a psilocybin journey, yeah, you're gonna get very overwhelmed very fast because you haven't slowly developed the capacity to be with discomfort. But when I work with people, oftentimes when we get to the point of feeling that discomfort, all of a sudden it's not so scary. It changes, it moves, it sizzles out. Um, and the fear around even feeling it is gone because we've just proven that we can do something hard. We can actually sit with an emotion. Look at that. Nothing bad happened. And our belief systems around that start to shift as well. So if you've said, like, in your head said, feeling my emotions is too scary, or it's wrong, or I had a family member, mother or father that was highly emotional and I vowed never to be like that. Feeling emotions looked scary to me as a kid, so I avoided it at all costs. Once you start to learn how to sit with them and to actually feel them, then those belief systems start to crumble away too, because you have just proven that that is not true. Also, with the nervous system involvement, histamine has relationships with all sorts of neurotransmitters, like histamine and dopamine. Histamine modulates dopamine release, so that can affect motivation, focus, pleasure. Histamine and serotonin have an inverse relationship. So higher histamine is going to mean lower serotonin. Plus, if you have those really high infections in the gut, that's where most of our serotonin is made. So that can affect your serotonin. Histamine and GABA are also opposite. Histamine is very stimulatory and GABA is very relaxing. Histamine and acetylcholine, this is a really big one for me because, and for probably most of you if you've taken medications, because acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that's involved with every automatic process of our body. And when we take a Benadryl, which is an anticholinergic medication, it's going to impact acetylcholine. And this is the reason why you have dry mouth and dry eyes oftentimes, because acetylcholine is involved with like the automatic lubrication of those areas. Acetylcholine is such a big piece of the puzzle to so many people because it also is involved with the gut. And if you were ever an alcohol drinker, or if you ever lived in chronic stress time periods, and if you've taken a lot of um, Benadryl in your life, which I definitely have, it can affect acetylcholine. And that's one of the reasons Benadryl has that warning of an increased risk of Alzheimer's later in life, because of its effect on acetylcholine. So B1 also helps to produce acetylcholine. It's involved in that. And I mentioned alcohol because it will severely deplete and prevent you from metabolizing B1, as well as the other B vitamins, which we won't get into in this podcast. But the Bs also are heavily influencing your methylation and some of these neurotransmitters, which can affect, again, histamine. There's all sorts of different relationships there. And then, of course, the minerals. We mentioned B vitamins, and then we have minerals. Tons of minerals will affect either breaking down histamine or other factors that could affect histamine, like high copper in the blood, copper that's not being metabolized correctly, which we need good liver function. We need the cofactors like vitamin A and zinc. We need healthy adrenal function to help make the copper binding protein. And if we don't have those things in place, or there's any sort of hiccup in that process, if we have unbound high copper in the blood, this is going to drive up estrogen. And high estrogen fuels high histamine. And high histamine, high estrogen will also affect cortisol. So you can see how there's all sorts of different triggers and relationships. That is why I love bioenergetics, because we see all of these at once. We see the relationships. Medications, especially birth control, that will affect estrogen. It can also impact copper. I have a lot of information on copper in my copper highlights that goes into detail about the rise in mental health symptoms in women after the start of the birth control pill. And these nutrient imbalances and toxicity loads, especially metals, which never break down, they do get passed down to us. So even if you never took birth control, did your grandmother? Did somebody in your lineage ever experience, especially the older kinds of birth control? Then also our changes in soil have a profound impact on our mineral status as well. So since our soil is very depleted and we have too much of certain minerals and not enough of other minerals, we're going to get mineral imbalances even from the foods that we eat. So the original HTMA ranges, according to Dr. Paul Eck, these were created back in the 70s, looking at very healthy athletes and also looking at that soil content. And I have never seen anyone's chromium in range ever on any tests. And chromium is essential for insulin signaling and cholesterol as well. And what is everyone struggling with now? Well, they're struggling with metabolic symptoms. So there's definitely something to our monocropping and the way that we process foods that significantly is affecting the health of the food, which is affecting us. It's not all because of seed oils. It's not all because of non-native EMS. It's not all because of our light environment. It's a combination of so many things, including nutrient deficiencies. Another big one for mast activation is zinc. Zinc totally changed my life. If you were ever a vegetarian, you probably have not gotten enough zinc in your life. And even if you were never, if you don't tolerate meat very well or don't eat it very often, or if you've eaten a lot of processed foods in your life, you probably are going to be low in zinc. On top of that, several heavy metals antagonize zinc. So most of us, even if we do try to eat pretty healthy, will have some degree of a zinc deficiency. And we can tell by looking at other aspects of the HTMA or on bioenergetics, how severe is the zinc deficiency and is now a right time to supplement zinc. And zinc is so amazing for so many factors. It helps to make stomach acid. It helps to make testosterone and progesterone. It helps with the foundational functioning of the immune system. And I've seen research on how zinc can actually turn off allergic responses. So this was something I learned in grad school, actually, that over time, not like in the moment, like, oh, I've got a hive reaction, let me take zinc. Not necessarily like that, but when those zinc stores become more replenished, then the IgE reactions start to go away. It's called class switching of the B cell, and your allergies start to go away. So zinc can take a really long time to replenish if you're really deficient, if you have health issues, especially something like severe allergies and mast cell activation, because so many things affect zinc. And one of my mentors always says it can take up to 7 years to even start to replenish a zinc deficiency. Now, I have improved and it's been 3 years. So I'm not saying like it'll take 7 years for you to even feel better, but that's just how depleted our society is of this mineral. Another really big one for mast activation is phosphorus. So when we have low phosphorus, we'll have lower acidity in the gut. It is the backbone of DNA and RNA, so it can affect epigenetic changes potentially. And with low phosphorus, we will also see higher fungal overgrowth, higher SIBO, for example, higher parasitic loads in people, which are part of that presentation of the chronic infections. And then, of course, there's the electrolytes. If you struggle with POTS and really low blood pressure, getting tons more sodium than you would ever think to imagine or ever be recommended can be helpful. It's not going to reverse the POTS, but temporarily it's going to really improve symptoms. And then things like potassium, which are essential for the electrical functioning of the body, our heart rate, which a lot of people I worked with, myself included, have had really bad heart palpitations, and you're left wondering, is this histamine? Is this potassium? Am I dying? So potassium is essential for the nervous system, and that sodium potassium pump is part of the foundation of how our cells work on a microscopic level, how well we're able to receive nutrients and hormones, and how well we're able to let waste out of the body. And then also, let's see what other nutrients are really big. Vitamin C is a huge one for mast cell stabilization. It oftentimes comes up on the biores testing for many, many, many of my clients because it is an antioxidant. It helps with immune system function. It stabilizes those mast cells. So nutrition is a major part of recovering from mast cell as well as that nervous system piece. And they go hand in hand because when you are very stressed, you're going to burn through more minerals, you're going to deplete B vitamins, and vice versa. When we have really low nutrients and the body's not able to function and the cells aren't able to do what they need to do, then that's going to be a stressor for the body. It's also going to be a breeding ground for overgrowth and infections. And so they're very bidirectional. Now, the last thing I want to talk about on this podcast is the theory of German New Medicine. Well, they say it's a discovery of how the body works and how our body is responding to the perceived stressors of our life. I've had a lot of guests on that have talked about German New Medicine, and they use it primarily for their clients that they work with. And for me, the most impactful understanding of German New Medicine is the understanding that our body is either responding to a stressor and making biologically meaningful adaptations, or the stressor is over and the body is resolving those adaptations. We don't need the adaptations anymore. So, just like if you were to go to a different country, and in this country, you need to dress a certain way and speak a certain way um, to get around, get where you're going to, you're not allowed to have certain drugs or things like that. Like you have to follow those rules. You've adapted the way that you act and the way that you are in that country. And then when you leave, you don't need those adaptations anymore. So our body is kind of like that. When we need to survive, it will adapt to either send more cells to a certain area or remove cells from a certain type of tissue. And then when we no longer need those adaptations, then it's going to rebuild those cells or it's going to dissolve those cells. And it does so with bacteria and fungi. So infections and high symptoms are oftentimes a response to resolving some major stressor or some major adaptation or changing your life in a way where you're no longer experiencing some sort of big emotional they call it a conflict, but it could be a trauma or just a pattern that you wanted to switch. On top of that, I would also like to add that dehydration can be a major factor in having higher allergies. And we need UV light as well as nutrition, B vitamins, minerals, and a connection with nature, touching the earth in order to stay hydrated. So our body makes something called easy water, exclusion zone water, which is like a fourth phase of water. It's neither liquid or solid. And it makes this in the electron transport chain process. And this is what actually keeps us hydrated. Now, that whole process needs the nutrients. The nutrition is so important there. But we need UV light to actually make that easy water. And so making sure to get outside, even if you're just in natural lighting in the winter, or if you are able to be in the shade somewhere, and if you're able to touch your feet on the earth, that is going to increase the ability for your body to make this easy water and keep you hydrated. And it's also going to be sending special codes to where you are on the earth, that electromagnetic field of the earth, the Schumann resonance, which is very relaxing and calming, and help your body just feel more safe, more grounded in the moment. So if it was me trying to heal from mast cell activation again, the first thing I would do is I would remove any sort of stress in my life that did not align with who I am, what I want to be. And this is kind of, what I had to do to heal. And then I also would spend as much time as I could in nature. If I could go to the beach and not work and spend all my time there, that's what I would be doing. But if you can't do that, just spending as much time as you can outside, feet on the earth, and then getting in as much nutrition as you can. If you have a hard time with foods and reactions, go as low histamine as you can for a brief period of time. support the body with certain supplements and possibly medications, which I have listed on the histamine and mast cell guide, all the different herbs and homeopathics options. I have peptides listed there, like KPV was extremely helpful for me and for a lot of people I've worked with for lowering and stabilizing, or for lowering histamine and stabilizing mast cells. I also have several different immune modulation techniques. I did low dose immunotherapy. NAET is another common one that's working on the nervous system. So all of those are listed, and websites to where you can find practitioners trained in all these things, as well as the nervous system, emotional health, trauma healing. I have all of that listed, as well as my services, what I do and how I work with people, as well as my programs. I teach what I like to call my 5-step process that incorporates somatic listening, somatic awareness, aspects of EMDR and neuroscience, self-soothing and psychosensory techniques, aspects of manifestation, and using the channels of awareness to step into the life and the body that you want or know that you can have. And my course, feeltoheal.co is available, that teaches that 5-step process. And also I run 3 groups a month that are supportive to people on that journey. So people not just using that process, we talk about all sorts of different things in these groups. Every group has a different topic, from anger to boundaries to attachment wounds to using the 5-step process, to what was the last one that we did? The voice in your head, the inner critic, the inner judgment, the ego. We talk about all sorts of stuff in these groups. And so any and all of those things, I would say, find what resonates and know and surrender to the fact that this is happening and this is your life. And there is a deeper meaning to why this is happening. For myself, I really wanted to be healthy. I wanted to take care of myself. I wanted to have a successful business, to break cycles of scarcity and lack. And I wanted to have a healthy relationship. I did not want to pass along alcohol abuse and maladaptive coping mechanisms to my future children. And I wanted to break cycles in my family. And what I got was all of those things, except it came through the lens of mast cell activation and mold illness and topical steroid withdrawal and all the things that I went through. I didn't even get to covering so many things that are on the mast cell activation guide. And everything that we talked about today is deeper in that guide. So check out my website, thehealerrevolution.com, as well as my Instagram at Amanda Panacea, where you'll find the link to that guide, as well as I have a 90-minute webinar that goes deeper into my 6 layers of mast cell activation and what that means in greater detail, even greater detail than we went into today, and what that looks like on testing and what that feels like, and solutions to all of those things as well. So you can find both of those things, the 90-minute webinar and the mast cell activation guide, on my website. And then I do have a longer 6-week program called Happy Histamine, which I ran back in 2024. And you can purchase that. It goes even deeper. There are 12 60 to 90-minute lectures in that program, as well as energy healing sessions that will help support recovery from MCAS. So thank you guys so much for listening. If this was helpful, or if you have any questions, send me a message. I love talking to you guys and finding out, where do you need support? What are you thinking about? What's the collective talking about that I maybe haven't studied or looked into yet? And I love interacting. So have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you, everyone. I am just so thrilled that you're listening to the Healer Revolution podcast. This has been a huge passion project for me and super therapeutic on top of that, helping me to use my voice and connect with other like-minded individuals. So if you're enjoying the podcast, please like and subscribe. Please share on social media or with your audience or friends or loved ones. I truly appreciate it. It does take a lot of time and financial costs to run the podcast, and it is not a moneymaker, let me tell you. So if you are enjoying this, I would truly appreciate your support just by sending me a post, a like, and a subscribe. Thank you so much.